Hello, my name is Jerry Zaks, and I am a second generation Holocaust survivor. And what that means is that both my parents survived multiple concentration camps during World War II. In this presentation, I will be discussing how to do the research to find out the story of my father. I have a second presentation, which is the story of my father and mother and how they survived the Holocaust, but I will not be doing that today. Today we will learn how I do the research. During the presentation, we're going to go over a number of different things. We're going to discuss actual available resources, physical archives versus what you can find on the internet. We're going to review some important websites of where you can find Holocaust information and the search techniques on how best to find them. Once you find information, it may be in another language and you may not understand what the documents mean. So we're going to go over the use and the meaning of documents, how to interpret your research, and how to translate different languages and find the use of specific abbreviations, which you'll come across. We'll also discuss use of the internet, how the different websites interact with each other, and the use of artificial intelligence. And we'll end with a review of things to keep in mind as you do the research. I was lucky enough that in 1980 I had the forethought of actually interviewing my parents, so I have 2 hours of audio cassette tape of interviewing my parents and their experiences. But reviewing them back in 2018 when I retired, I realized basically that I was the worst interviewer in the world, and I allowed my parents to go off on dozens of different tangents. And when I reviewed them, for example, for my father, I really could only pick out very few specific pieces of factual information to go by. So I know he was born in Bendin, Poland. He discussed how the Germans marched into town and how the Germans burned down the Great Bendin Synagogue. I know he told me that he was in 4 different concentration camps: Blechheimer, Buchenwald, Gross-Rosen, and Dachau. And he mentioned that he got his tattoo in Blechheimer, but I don't know the order of the concentration camps he was in and why he was moved from one to the other. He also mentioned he was on 3 death marches, but I don't know what they were and when they occurred. So I set out on a quest that has taken me for about over 6 years of research to try and find the threads that tie these facts together and build his complete story. So in this talk, we're going to try and build a timeline for my father. And we'll start in 1937, when I know he was running a successful butcher business with his father. And I know he mentioned that the Germans invaded Bendin, Poland on a certain day and burned down the Great Synagogue, but I don't know exactly when. I don't know when they invaded Bendin, what happened when they burned down the synagogue. I don't know what concentration camps he was in what order and when he was in them. I don't know the tattoo number that he was given in Blechheimer. He mentioned that he was on 3 death marches, but I don't know which death marches, when and why they occurred, and what happened to him after he was liberated. So where do we start? Now, this is actually a new slide that I've added just recently. Many people know of Google and other internet search engines, and in the past, when you would ask a question of a search engine, you would normally get just a list of other websites to go start researching and start reading about. But with the advent of artificial intelligence in the last 2 or 3 years, many of these websites have become much, much more powerful, and you're able to ask direct questions and get specific answers. So, for example, I wanted to ask the question, when did the Germans burn down the Bendin Great Synagogue? And Google actually now has an AI overview. There's another wonderful website that I personally like very much called Perplexity, which is all driven by AI. And when you ask this specific question directly to these websites, you actually get the answer. Google specifically says in the first answer, The Great Synagogue of Bendin, Poland, was burned down by the Germans on September 8th. If you read further, you find out when the Germans actually invaded Bendin on September 4th. They burned down the synagogue on during Friday night services on September 8th. So from Friday night services through Saturday morning services, September 9th, hundreds of victims were burned down, and the entire surrounding neighborhood was burned down. So we can immediately go back to a timeline, and we can fill in that the Germans invaded Bendin on September 4th, and the Great Bendin Synagogue was burned down on September 8th. But internet engine searches can only take us so far. So where do we go next to really find out more details? There are many, many websites, many archives, but the one that I have to stress upon you is the first place you should go, the most important place to go, is known as the Arolsen Archives. Now, during the war and right after the war, the Allied forces, they created DP camps, displaced persons camps, where people could go and could sign up, they could register themselves, they can request information about other family members can find them. These displaced persons camps gathered so much information that they turned into the International Tracing Service, which was dedicated to determining the fates and research and searching for missing persons. Over the years, this has now turned into Arolsen Archives, located in Germany, subsidized by the German government. And it now is the largest repository of information for the Holocaust and for victims of Nazi aggression anywhere in the world. It has over 30 million original documents covering over 20 million people. Germany was absolutely obsessed with documenting their atrocities, and there has never been a genocide that's been so well documented. And Arolsen Archives has the most information in any one place. On top of that, it should be noted that Arolsen Archives has over 13 million of those 30 million, about 43%, are available online. So you want to go to arolsenarchives.org, and this is the first website you'll see. This is what it will look like. And the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you switch it to English, because it may come up in German. And then you want to click this main button to start your search. When you do, the screen will turn into this. The first thing before we actually start a search is to note these three primary buttons here on the right-hand side. The first one is actually a very good 4.5-minute training video made by Arolsen Archives on how best to use their archives. The second one is a thing called the e-guide, which we will go into in detail. And the third one is how to submit a direct inquiry to Arolsen Archives in order for them to find out more information for you. We'll talk more about each of those, but when we do, remember that this is the easiest way to get to these two places. Now we're about to start our first search, and you want to enter your information up here, up here. And when you do, information about people will show up in one section, and particular topics will show up in another section. So the first thing I want to do is simply put in my father's name, Saul Zaks. Right? And when I do, and when I hit search, Arolsen Archives comes up with 9 records that it finds. Now, each one of these rows is one record, and each record contains one or more images of documents about that record. Okay? And you go through these one at a time to try and find out the information that's in each record. So let's choose this one. This one actually says Saul Joseph Zaks, which is exactly my father's name, and this is his exact birthday, so I'm pretty sure this is definitely my father. We'll click on it, and when you do, it turns this turquoise color, and the right side of the screen turns into images of the documents that are related to that record. Great, now we want to find out more about each one of these images. So you start clicking on them one at a time. We'll click on the first one, right? And what happens is a window opens up with a close-up of that specific document. And you can see that it actually says Saul Joseph Zaks. His birthday is listed here, May 30th, 1919. Benzenberg is German for the town of Bendin, where he grew up. You'll notice there are these numbers, which I don't appreciate what they are. You'll notice that it actually says concentration camp Buchenwald, so there's an interesting point that my father must have had something to do with Buchenwald. And on top of that, you see all of these lists of words. They're German words. Many of them are abbreviations. So let alone I don't know how to speak German, I also don't understand what these abbreviations mean. So how do you start trying to figure out what this document is? And this is where we come up with the e-guide that I mentioned earlier. Remember, you go to that first page, you go to the e-guide. And when you do, you try and remember what this document looked like. Maybe you want to put it in another window and open up the e-guide in a separate window so you can keep taking a look at this. Because when you open up the e-guide, what it has is 178 German documents. This number changes all the time, by the way, but the last time I looked, I counted 178 German documents that were used throughout the war by Germany. And there are pictures of these documents. So what you simply do is you start scrolling through these documents, these pictures, looking for a document that looks like the one you're interested in. And sure enough, here's one that looks exactly like the document that I found for my father. When you put the cursor over it, it turns this dark color, and in white letters it gives you the name of the document. But what's more important is when you click on the document, the screen changes to be a close-up of the document. Now, it's not going to be the document you found. This isn't the document for my father, but it's the sample that Arlson Archives has used to build this e-guide, but it looks exactly like the same document. So it gives a picture of the document, and most importantly, it gives you a full description of how that document is used, okay, and what it's used for and what it means. On top of that, as you move the cursor around the document, you'll see certain areas highlight in gray. And if you click on one of those fields, the text on the right changes to not be a description of the full document, but to be a description of that specific field itself. So by going over the documents, by going over the fields in the documents, you can learn more and more about what this document is, what it means. But not all the fields are grayed out. So what do you do? Now these fields, as I say, they're in German, they're German words. Many of them have abbreviations. So I want to tell you about another research tool that I've discovered. And this is not from Arlson Archives. This is actually from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And on their website, they have a website called the Glossary of Terms and Abbreviations found in the archives of the International Tracing Service. So the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has gone through all of the documents that the International Tracing Service has ever had and has created this document, which is over 300 pages of words and abbreviations that are used in all of the documents that the Nazis used during the war. It's fully in alphabetical order, as well as you can search. And I can now look at my father's document, and I can see that what this means is his birthplace. And what this means here, with a little 2 next to it, I can find that this is a work card. So before, when I read the description of what this document is, when I've analyzed each one of these fields and the fact that there are numbers next to it, I learned that what this is simply an envelope, okay, created by the International Tracing Service. And whenever a document is found for my father for Buchenwald, they find this envelope, they put that document in this envelope, and they update the count of the documents that are inside this envelope. So in the International Tracing Service somewhere, there is this envelope with 7 documents in it. Okay, and that's all this is. This is an organization tool used by the International Tracing Service. This leads me to an interesting concept. Now, many of these things are factual, and I'm telling you exactly the way things work. Sometimes I'm going to go into opinions of Jerry Zaks, my personal opinions. So as I've done my research for 6 years, I've learned that there are different levels of importance that you can place on documents. The least level is documents that were created by the International Tracing Service or by Arlson Archives, and they're simply cross-reference documents. They have worth, they have importance, they have information, but it didn't happen during the war. It's not information directly from my parents. Somebody in Arlson Archives and the International Tracing Service has created this envelope or has created this cross-reference card for my mother. So they put information on it. They put my mother's name, they put my mother's maiden name, they put her birthday, and they put information that she was in Blechheimer and she was in Bergen-Belsen. There's information on how to track down other pieces of information. But it itself did not come from the Nazis or come from my mother. So you've got to weigh that with a grain of salt. The middle level of importance is documents that came from the DP camps themselves, from when my mother and when my father actually went into a displaced persons camp and filled out a form or gave some information. So when my mother and father registered themselves at this DP camp outside of Stuttgart, Germany, somebody at the DP camp is interviewing my parents. Okay, so this is information directly from my parents, directly from my father. But on the other hand, you've played telephone as a kid before. How good is your memory? Remember, so this is my parents giving information that may be 1 week old or maybe 4 years old. So maybe they missed something. Maybe they forgot something. Maybe it just slipped their minds. So again, this is pretty important. It's coming directly from my parents, but still there could be mistakes in it. Finally, the highest level of importance that I personally place are documents that actually came from the Nazis during the war, all right? Such as my father's Buchenwald registration card, okay? And my father's Buchenwald work card, okay? This is my father showing up in Buchenwald, being registered, getting a new number, and him actually signing it at the time. So this is the highest level of importance. Right? A document like this shows he came from Gross Rosen and he is now registering in Buchenwald. This is very important information. So now I can go back to the timeline and I can add, I know he was in Buchenwald, but I still don't know exactly when. So now let's go back to the research that we've been doing and to the documents that we found. And let's look at some of the other documents. Now, we don't have time to go through all of them, but I want to pick another one here, and we'll open that up and we'll take a look at it. And we'll go to the e-guide, but we'll find that this document is not found in the e-guide. The e-guide's incredibly powerful. I don't want to understate the importance of the e-guide and its worth, but the fact is not every single document that you'll come across is there. So how do we start figuring out what this document is? Well, I could go to that glossary of terms and start looking up every single one of these German words one at a time, but I want to show you yet another tool that I've discovered. I don't want to turn this into a computer programming class and teach you computers, but I think we all know about the concept of copying and pasting text from one document to another on a computer. You can also do that with images. And on my computer, you use the right mouse button and you find a pop-up where I can copy this image. Okay, so now I've got this image in my paste buffer on my computer and I want to move to another website that I've discovered. And this is called yandex.com, yandex.com. And this website is a free website that allows you to translate text, images, PDF files, as well as websites. And when you set your the flag to translate an image, you get this screen. And then what I want to do is you paste the document into it. And what happens is immediately, right on top of the graphic image of the document, the translations start appearing. So now I can read this document in English, right? Name of parents, wife's name, military service. So all this is in English. Now, this is an incredibly powerful, very useful tool, but be aware it does not handle handwriting, like my father's signature. It can't handle very well. and it can't handle things that are on an angle very well. But it's still pretty good. It's still pretty amazing to actually try to figure out what this document is. Okay. Um, the other thing is, as you're looking at this, if you want to try and analyze it a little bit better, oh, and it also doesn't handle abbreviations very well. Uh, so now when you want to try and analyze this document, you can go back and forth between the original with these buttons here. You can flip back and forth between the original language and the translated language over and over again to help you understand what this is. And what you learn in time is that this happens to be a transfer document for my father. Okay. One important aspect of this document is it's the only document I ever found that documents the fate of my grandparents. Herschel Zaks, who's also a butcher, and Friedla Zaks, whose maiden name is Jakubowicz. They went to concentration camp Birkenau. Really a powerful piece of information. But most importantly, this document documents that he was in Gross Rosen and on February 9th, he left Gross Rosen and got transferred to concentration camp Buchenwald the same day, February 9th. A really powerful piece of information. So now we go back to the timeline and we'll add, okay, I know he was in Gross Rosen, but I don't know when he arrived in Gross Rosen, but I do know now when he arrived in Buchenwald, and I have his transfer document. Before we leave that Yandex research thing, I want to mention one other important aspect of it. I mentioned that it handles different types of research. Here I got an email from Auschwitz Archives. I actually wrote directly to Auschwitz with some questions for them to do some research on my grandfather. And I got this email back. And I take that email and I can copy and paste it. When I switch to text instead of images, I can actually paste the email directly into the left side of the document, and I get the translation on the right side of the document. Now, the last time I used this tool, I was set to translate from German to English. And when you translate this from German to English, you'll see that the translation doesn't work at all, because this happens not to be German, it happens to be Polish. So you should note that when you use this tool and it actually shows you the languages that it's translating from and to, these are actually buttons. And if you click on the German, you get a pop-up which shows that German is currently selected with the check mark, and I now want to check Polish, right? And you can go through Polish and Czechoslovakian and France, to try and figure out what language it came in. But I know that this came from Polish. I know it's not German, so I'm going to try Polish next. And when I switch this to Polish by clicking on Polish, this stays the same, but now it's translating from Polish to English, and you can see the translation works perfectly. Okay, whatever this is actually the person sought. So this is all the information on me, the person who's seeking information, and the person that I'm asking about, and all the information I gave them. So this is an email that I got from the Auschwitz Archives. When I sent them a piece of an email, they got back to me saying, okay, we received it. This is what we're going to look at. It takes about 9 weeks to get back to you, right? So very important translation tool. The next thing I want to talk about is search techniques. Whenever we do searches, right, I put in Saul Zaks, and you'll notice, if you remember, that I got back many different responses. Whenever you do a search on any website, and I've got 4 here, for example, and there are dozens and dozens of them, I've never run across a search website or an archive that doesn't have some form of this capability. This is from Ancestry.com. This is Jewish Records Indexing for Poland. This is JewishGen.com. They all have these capabilities. And all of them you can search on different data types, right, which is important, like your last name, your given name, what town you want to look for, if you know the prisoner number, what year they were born, types of information, data, types of data. But more importantly is the search types, okay? When you do a search, you can set it to search for something exactly the way you typed it. Or you can search for something that begins or ends with something. or if it contains a set of letters, right? One of the more powerful ones is phonetically like, okay? You want to search for something that's phonetically sounds like the thing you typed in, but may be spelt very differently. And then some engines are incredibly powerful. They've got these terms called fuzzy, fuzzier, and fuzziest. You may see those. Okay, you may think those are cute, childish little toys, but actually they're computer programming terms. Fuzzy means if I give you 4 letters like Z-A-K-S, fuzzy means you look up Z-A-K-S, but also look up every combination where 2 letters are switched, because somebody could have made a typing mistake. So it would return Z-A-K-S, but it would also return A-Z-K-S, and it would return Z-K-A-S, and it would return Z-A-S-K, 2 letters. Fuzzier is 3 letters in any combination, but the 3 letters have to be next to each other, and they switch them around for every combination of permutation. Fuzziest is any 3 letters anywhere in the words. So we could take the first and the last and the middle and look for that, right? So look for that. Now the thing is each time you add a more open type of search, like begins with or contains or phonetically, okay, you're going to absolutely get more and more results back. But as you get more and more results back, there's a chance they don't really apply to who you're looking for, right? But you still want to look because you just don't know, okay? So again, Jerry Zaks' personal opinion is always start with is exactly when you can. Start with is exactly. That would give you the smallest number of hits, but the ones that have the highest probability of being what you're looking for. Let's go through 2 examples. First, we'll go back to my initial search in Arrowson Archives with Saul Zaks, right? You'll notice, remember, it came back with 9 records. But the 9 records not only included ZAKS, which I searched for, it also came back with SACHS, right? Phonetically sounding like. And it also looks for phonetically across every field that it's searching for. So it also came back with Saul, S-A-U-L, that I put in, but it also came back with Shaul, S-C-H-A-U-L. And it also came back with some woman whose maiden name was S-A-K-S. So it wasn't even Z-A-K-S, and it wasn't the surname. It was, this is phonetically like it, and it's showing up in the maiden name. So it gave me back these results. Of these results, these 4 are for my father, right, Saul Zaks. And you still go through every single one of them, and I actually find that this Saul Zaks, right, S-A-C-H-S, is also my father. So I would have missed that if I did just is exactly. But I started with is exactly, but then I still looked for everything else because you don't know what else you can find. This is actually his registration at a displaced persons camp. Okay? But when you want to start with is exactly and you want to filter it down. Now, this came up with 9 results, so it was very easy for me to go through all 9 very quickly. But very easily, you could wind up with 90 results, or you could wind up with 900 results, right, that you don't want to go through. So how do you do is exactly in Arrowson Archives? And I'm going to go through this detail because Arrowson Archives is the most important. You'll notice these little icons. I really can't even tell what they're supposed to mean. Little funnels they look like, right? Each one of these little icons is a filter icon, okay? And you can filter this column with any one of the different search types that you want to apply. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick this first one, and when you pick this first one, you get this pop-up. It defaults to contains, but you can click on contains and get a pop-up. So you can do contains, does not contain, or here's the one that I use, is equal to. So if I click is equal to, you get that pop-up again, the first pop-up again. It says is equal to. Now you fill in what you want it to filter on, and when you hit apply, these 9 records turn into 4, right? And it actually tells you that I'm showing you 4 records out of 9. The little filter icon now turns yellow to indicate that there's a filter being activated here. And now I get a higher probability. These are all my father. I've looked at each one of these. But remember, I missed one where someone typed their name as S-A-K-S, and that was also my father. So I went through these four first, but in time I went through the others and found another piece of information. Let's go through another example, and we'll go to a different website. We'll go to JRI Poland, okay? JRI Poland has the ability to specify up to 4 different data types. For each data type, you can select a search type. So in this case, I put in Zaks as their last name, Saul, S-A-U-L, as their first name, and I also limited it to Bendine, Poland, right? And I put is exactly for everything. Is exactly Zaks, is exactly Saul, is exactly Bendine, okay? And what I find is exactly what you see on the screen. Absolutely nothing. It gave back no results whatsoever. So, and that can happen, right? So you start opening it up. I just simply decide, let's keep Zaks accurate, but Saul can be spelled lots of different ways, and I know Bendine can be Benzenberg or can be Bendine and can be spelled differently. So I'm going to change these to phonetically like and do the search again, and I immediately come up with the 1939 Bendine census for my entire family. And you'll notice specifically this line here is Saul Joseph Zaks, but they didn't spell it S-A-U-L. They spelled it S-Z-O-E-L, right? Some type of Polish spelling for my father's name. So is exactly didn't work, but when I did phonetically like Saul, I got Shoal Joseph Zaks, right? And I find my father's entire family. My grandparents, Hirschlig and Friedla Zaks, Shaya, my father's older brother, and Schlamek, which is my father's younger brother. So this is really interesting. The 1939 census, here they are. But most importantly, I actually find the address, right? They had a census in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland, and I have their address. So I can now go to Google Maps and go to the street view, and I can take a look at the building that my father lived in 1939. And I've got proof of this because back in 2019, I actually went to Poland and I went to Germany. I visited Bendine, Poland. I visited this house. I walked through this entryway and found the barns in the backyard that my father explained to me where he kept his horses. So, again, this is website interaction and how you can use it. Sitting in my home, I actually can see the home that my father lived in. You'll also notice that on this piece of information from JRI Poland, there's a little button here. Click here for more information. Now, I have for more details. I don't know what this is going to do, but I'm certainly going to click it. When you click this, it brings you to another complete organization, jewishgen.org. All of these organizations are trying to preserve information about the Holocaust and about Jews' experiences through the Holocaust. They all work together. Yad Vashem, Jewish Gen, JRI Poland, dozens of others. So this brought me to jewishgen.org, and it pointed to dozens and dozens and dozens of documents about Bendine, Poland. It took me actually a couple of weeks to slowly go through all the information. Some of it had nothing to do with anything I was interested in. Some of it was interesting about the life of people in Bendine, Poland. And then I bumped into this page, okay? And here's a picture of all these men. I have no idea what it's about. It simply it reads that these are people of the Artisan Guild in 1937. And I'm looking at the picture just out of interest. And you know, sure enough, this guy up here, man, if he doesn't look like the one picture I have of my grandfather. The mustache, the face, the roundness of the face. And I'm saying to myself, well, what in heaven's name is the probability that I found the picture of my grandfather in 1937? But all these men have numbers next to them. So I read further in the article, and I find a list of everybody in this picture. And this guy is number 37 and number 27. And sure enough, number 27 is G. Zaks, right? His Yiddish name was Gershon Zaks, who I am named after. So sure enough, by going to JRI Poland, winding up with the census, winding up in jewishgen.org, I found a picture of my grandfather finding out that he was a leader in the Butchers Artisan Guild in Bending, Poland in 1937. Pretty just amazing stuff. So at this point, I can now go back to our timeline and I can add the picture of my father's house in 1937. Let's talk about going to other archives. I'll start again with Arolsen Archives because we did the search before, but Arolsen Archives also organizes things in dozens of different archives. So you can go to Browse Archives and they got archives on specific camps, on death marches, on prisoner and prisoners, that you can search by prisoner number if you know their number. They've got archives on people in ghettos. They've got archives on death marches. You can search this by town and by geographical regions. And there is a very extensive help guide and tips to this archive. But there, like I mentioned, there are dozens and dozens of different archives. So one thing that you do is you go to Google, right, or any other search engine that you want, and you look for archives, right? You put in Holocaust Archives, or you put in Holocaust Archives for Poland, Holocaust Archives for Czechoslovakia. You put in, Auschwitz Archives, or Gross-Rosen Archives, or Buchenwald Archives, and you can find archives on very specific things. You can also look for archives for immigration, for Ellis Island, for the Library of Congress. There are dozens and dozens of ones. And one example is when I put in a search for Buchenwald prisoner list, right? I did a search. I wound up with all of these and I looked through all of them. This one in particular was Buchenwald Concentration Camp World War II Database. This is a website called WW2DB, World War II Database. I would never have gone to World War II Database, but it came up when I searched for Buchenwald prisoner lists. When I go to this website and start searching around, I actually found these documents, okay? This is a document when people came from Gross-Rosen on a death march from Gross-Rosen to, when people came from Gross-Rosen by train to Buchenwald, they registered everybody. This is, and they came on February 9th, and they created a list of people that came off the train. This is an addendum to it. It was done like 11 days later. This German translates to, using that translator tools I've given you, this title translates to Addendum to the Change Report of February 10th. This was done on February 21st. This is a list of 2,460 new additions from Gross-Rosen. This is in Buchenwald. These are people that came from Gross-Rosen. Okay? And sure enough, on page 2, prisoner number 124560 is S.J. Zaks, Saul Joseph Zaks. So I found my father on a list coming from Gross-Rosen, going into Buchenwald, and I find out his new number. This is the number that he was assigned in Buchenwald, and this is his Buchenwald registration card. I found it through Arolsen Archives. Now I also found it through this. So now I can go back to our timeline, and I'm going to change his transfer document to his actual registration. All right. Now, as I mentioned, Arolsen Archives and all these archives, there's only a certain amount of information which is actually online, right? There's 30 million documents in Arolsen Archives, but only 42% of them are online. So what you want to do is contact these archives directly. And 2 of them are very, very powerful and very, very well known. Arolsen Archives, when you go to their website, remember I mentioned there's the e-guide button and then there's direct inquiry button. When you click the direct inquiry button, you get this web page. And you fill it out with as much information as you've got, right? It'll ask you questions about you and why you're looking. It'll ask you questions, what information have you got for me to look at? And I've done this for my grandfather, my grandmother, for my father, for my, you put in these queries. And what it does is it goes to volunteers who work at Arolsen Archives, and they will go through the actual archives themselves to try and find everything they possibly can, okay? And they will send it back to you. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has the same thing. right? It's a very long and complex website. I suggest you go to Google and you type in United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Research and Individual. You'll get this website. Again, it's the same thing. You fill out as much information as you can. Some volunteer will go through their archives and send you back the information. Also, just email camp archives directly. I've emailed Gross Rosen archives, I've emailed Buchenwald archives, so their own specific archives, they don't have websites with their archives online at all, right? But when I wrote to Gross Rosen, they were the ones that explained to me that, yes, when prisoners went from concentration camp to concentration camp, they would get new numbers. It wouldn't necessarily be tattooed on them, but you'd get a new number. So it's very, very important that you write directly to these archives. Just write it in, fill out the form, and then wait. Now, in the case of Arolsen Archives, they are swamped. They've only got a certain number of volunteers, and it took 9 months to get back. I had given up on Arolsen Archives, but one day, literally 9 months later, I got a single email from Arolsen Archives saying, okay, here's the results of your request. And they sent me 3 zip files. I'm not sure everybody knows what a zip file is, but on computers, it's a way of compressing a tremendous amount of information and making it as small as possible so you can send it in an email, right? And you simply double click on it and it opens up to all the files that are in there, right? So they sent me 3 zip files. When I opened it up, there were hundreds of documents. There was over 100 documents. And it took me weeks to go through every single document. Now, many of the documents were documents that I had already found online. Fine, now I have them all in one place. But I found a couple of amazing things. And I'll give you just 2 examples, okay? Example 1 is my father, I know now, went to Buchenwald, and he mentioned that he was in Blechheimer, Buchenwald, Dachau, and Gross Rosen. He never mentioned that he was in this subcamp of Buchenwald. Here is the transfer document of my father. Now, I know he entered Buchenwald on February 9th. Here, 8 days later, he was transferred to Halberstadt, okay? So he went to Buchenwald and he went to a subcamp. In his mind, right, when he filled out the displaced persons camp, the information, he didn't even know it was another subcamp. He didn't even know it was another concentration camp with another name. You know, he was in Buchenwald and they made him move to another barracks, down the road or whatever. He never even considered that a change. He thought he was still in Buchenwald. But I now know that he was actually in another concentration camp. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned, a story that my father told during my audio interview was how his mother was selected one day. The selection processes happened all the time, and at any time anyone could be stopped on the street, questioned on the street, and selected to be sent off to concentration camp. And that is what happened to his mother, my grandmother. She was out grocery shopping, and she never came home. He went to the grocery store, he asked around, he found out what happened to her. She was questioned on the street coming back to the house. She was put in a holding area where she was going to be deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau the next morning. And it's a whole other story that takes a half hour to tell about how he snuck in and saved her, okay? But what I found was coming back from Arolsen Archives was her arrest record of that night. Okay, he told the story, and here is her arrest record. Friedla Sarah Zaks, that's her birth year, and it actually says that she was arrested and she was sent to an assembly point that she was going to be deported to Auschwitz the next day. So my father told the story, but now I found the actual document of my grandmother's arrest and exactly the day it happened. So I can now go back to my timeline and I can add my grandmother when she was arrested and about to be sent to Auschwitz. And I can also add that on February 17th, my father moved from Buchenwald to another concentration camp. Now, speaking of searching tips, right, I also want you to think about different things that, and be creative and experiment around. You never know what you can find, okay? And one important thing is hidden gems can be found in old photos, all right? Now, I knew my father had a tattoo for countless years, but I never knew the number, right? I know it now, right? But I never knew the number. So I found this old picture of my father in a short sleeve shirt with his arm facing the right way, scanned it into my computer, blew it up, and I can see his tattoo for the first time, 179085. When I look across numerous documents, right, I now see 179085 written all over the place because it's now on all these documents. But on top of that, when I went to the State Museum of Auschwitz in Birkenau, and I searched their archive, I searched it by prisoner number, I got a money account card. I personally don't really understand how money account card. So when he first went to Blechheimer, he had 100 units of 100 Deutschmarks on him that were taken away. And they actually document that he had this money, right? And I found this through the State Museum Auschwitz-Birkenau archive by searching by his prisoner number, and now I know his prisoner number. I know I'm talking mostly about my dad, but a really good example of experimenting and being creative is from my mother I want to talk about. I never knew the names of my maternal grandparents, okay? I was never able to find out. And one of the things, so I couldn't do searches on them. But going through these old pictures, I found this old picture of my mother in a blouse, which I've seen 100 times, but I never really thought about it. And she has embroidered on her blouse TZ. Now, her name was Berta, B-E-R-T-A, B-E-R-T-A. But all of her friends, all my life, always called her Tusha, right? Her Yiddish name, Tusha. And here she is with a blouse embroidered with TZ, Tusha Zaks. So for the very first time, after 3 years of research, not being able to find out anything about my maternal grandparents, right? I said, you know something? Since she's wearing this with Tusha Zaks, let me go back to Arlson Archive and put in her maiden name, Goldstein, but with Tusha instead, okay? So now for the first time, after 3 years of research, I put in Tusha Goldstein, and I get 2 hits, right? And one of them, by the way, because Arlson Archives always does phonetically, they spelled Tushka differently than I spelled it, but I still found it. And when I search this record and I find this image, this is an image of my mother going back to a displaced persons camp after the war, right? In July of 1947, after the war, she went back to a displaced persons camp, filled out this form, searching for her mother and father. So she actually put in her mother's name, Sarah Goldstein, and her father's name, Moritz Goldstein. From this search my mother did in 1947, from me searching for her Yiddish name, was the first time I actually find out the names of my maternal grandparents. Now, I have to admit, comes some of the most boring research, right? All of this is interesting, and you search for something, right? And you put it together, and it's great. You find documents. But I have to say that a tremendous amount of the research that you do is really by simply reading. Reading and learning and reading more and more and more, right? You just find out, and you find out how pieces come together, right? I read up a lot about Bending Poland in lots of different websites and in many different textbooks. I certainly now have already found when the Germans marched into town and that they burned down the Great Synagogue. But in doing reading and doing research, I actually found pictures of the Great Synagogue in a postcard before the war and the same exact angle, because here's the Great Bending Castle up on the hill, and there it is still intact. But the synagogue, where it was in the entire surrounding area, was burned down, and it gives you an understanding of the pain and suffering that they went through. Now, I also mentioned how my father saved his mother from being deported to Auschwitz by sneaking her out of that thing. What he also mentioned was he got Rosner work permits, right? And that saved him from being deported, him and his family from being deported. That he went on the black market and purchased 5 Rosner work permits. And years, 30, 40 years after making that recording, and I'm listening to it, I'm saying to myself, what's he talking about? What's Rosner work permits? What does he mean? So you read up on Bendine, Poland, and you learn this whole story about this gentleman, Alfred Rosner, who was sent to Bendine to create manufacturing of textiles and making German uniforms with Jewish slave labor, right? But he was a good guy. He's righteous among nations because he saved hundreds of Jews over the years, okay, because he knew what was going on. So my father went to the factory and purchased these Rosner work permits because if you had a Rosner work permit, you were essential to the German war effort. And Alfred Rosner knew about that, knew people were buying his work permits on the black market, and he was fine with that. So you learn more about what those Rosner work permits were, how the selection process actually worked, right? And then you say to yourself, okay, so if he had these Rosner work permits, why did he finally get sent to a concentration camp? He had these Rosner work permits. Well, you learn that Bendine was declared Judenrein by the Nazis, cleansed of all Jews in August of 43. And that there was a big selection process in August of 43. And the Hozaks family went from the ghetto during that last liquidation in August of 43. And the Rosner work permits were torn up and everybody was deported because every Jew in Bendine, Poland was being sent away. So I know that he was sent away in August of 43 to go to his first concentration camp. And you also learn in another book, Auschwitz Chronicle, I read that in April 1st of 44, right, Blechheimer, a concentration camp supporting the synthetic oil refineries, was taken over by Auschwitz. And somebody was sent from Auschwitz to tattoo everybody in Blechheimer on April 1st. And I found this document that says over 3,000 male prisoners were given the numbers 176512 through 179567. My father's number is 179085. So he was within these 3,000 male prisoners in Blechheimer getting his tattoo on April 1st in Blechheimer. Right? So this is research from just doing reading about Auschwitz, doing reading about Bendine, Poland. But with this now new knowledge, I can go back to my timeline and I can talk about how between 42 and 43, the Hozaks family survived numerous selections thanks to the Rosner work permits. Now I know that Bendine was declared Judenrein in August of 43, and that's when my father went to Blechheimer. More reading I find in another book, right, the Jewish Virtual Library documents. I actually find that there was a death march from Blechheimer, that the Russians are approaching Blechheimer in January of 45, and Blechheimer is evacuated, and everybody in Blechheimer is on a death march, and I find all of the towns that the death march went through to Gross Rosen. Now, my father said he was in Blechheimer. He said he was in Gross Rosen. I didn't know when. I didn't know why. He also mentions he was in death marches. I didn't know which ones. I didn't know why. But this here explains it. I know he's in Blechheimer when the Russians now approach in January of 45, right? Him and everybody in Blechheimer go on this death march. I actually learned the towns that it goes through, and I drove this death march when I was in Poland in 2019, and then I visited Gross Rosen. And then I learned, and from this other document that I had that I've already shown you, I learned, through my reading, I learned that everybody in Gross Rosen only was there for 7 days when the Russian army is continuing to approach from the east, and everybody in Gross Rosen gets placed in the cattle car transport trains further west into Buchenwald. So I learned this, And I'm reading this from books that says, okay, the death march was in January 21st. Everybody on the death march arrived on February 2nd. I read that everybody on that death march were there for only 7 days. So does that mean my father left Gross Rosen to go to Buchenwald on February 9th, right? February 7th, February 2nd plus 7 days? Well, that sure seems plausible, but I have the document of his transfer. That actually documents February 9th is when he leaves Gross Rosen. February 9th is when he arrives at Buchenwald. So I've read it in my research, and I've got Nazi documentation proving that my father was on the death march from Blechheimer to Gross Rosen, and then was put in the cattle car train to Buchenwald. So I can go back to my timeline, and I can now fill in when there was this death march, when he arrived in Gross Rosen, and that when he went from Gross Rosen to Buchenwald, he went on this train. Finally, further reading talks about how the Allied forces approach from the north and are about to liberate Buchenwald. And that everybody in Buchenwald is evacuated on April 2nd. And through my research, I actually find a picture of the death march out of Buchenwald. I also find that later that month, after he goes to Dachau, that the Allied forces are still approaching from the north. Dachau's about to be liberated. So Dachau is evacuated on April 26th. Through my research, I actually find a picture of the death march out of Dachau in Percha, Germany. But when I visited Dachau and I visited the museum on the grounds of Dachau, I actually found this picture of the death march out of Dachau. And it documents that the death march left on April 26th and went right through Percha, Germany. And this picture, which I found somewhere else, is a picture of the death march out of Dachau taken on April 28th, 2 days later. So these two pictures of death marches, these are death marches without question that my father was on. He could be in these pictures somewhere. And from my father's testimony, I know that he was liberated during that death march, going south out of Dachau. So again, I can go back to my timeline and I can fill in when Buchenwald was evacuated, right, and when Dachau was evacuated. Finally, I learned the details of how my father and mother meet in a wedding in Stuttgart. My brother was born 9 months later. They lived in Stuttgart for 2 years. Here is their displaced persons camp near Stuttgart for everybody living off-site of the displaced persons camp. I can see the registration of my mother and father, and I get their address. So I can go again to Google Maps and see the house that my parents lived in Stuttgart, Germany. From Ancestry.com, I can actually find the ship manifest of when they finally emigrated to the United States. And I can find all this information of where they left from and what date they came from. This is all from Ancestry.com. And I also find the name of the ship that they were on. And again, going through Google, I can actually find a picture of the ship my parents were on when they emigrated to the United States. So we can finish up the timeline that says my parents meet and my brother was born in 47, and in 49 here's the ship manifest and the ship of them emigrating to the United States. So here's my father's complete story of from before the war to emigrating to the United States. Before I finish up, I want to just throw two other pieces of information at you real quickly. We've talked about how you actually find actual Nazi documentation, right? Very powerful, very important tools. But I want to throw one other tool at you, which I find interesting. It's the only place I ever found such a thing. JewishGen.com, which I mentioned, they have a tool called the Jewish Gen Family Finder. It's another web page with the same type of information. You can put in different search data types, and you can search in different ways. So I can search for Zaks from Bending, Poland, or from Poland. And what this does is it doesn't find information specifically about Zaxes in Poland. What it does is it searches for everyone else who is a member of Jewish Gen who has also searched for Zaxes in Poland. Okay? And you can make it as fine a search as possible. And it gives you a way to contact these people. It doesn't give you their address and email directly. It allows you to write an email. It goes to Jewish Gen forwards it to them. Okay? So I can now contact this person, David Kornbush. I don't know where he lives. I don't know why he searched for Zaxes in Poland, but I can write him a mail that says, hey, I'm a Zax. My father grew up in Będzin, Poland. Do you have any connection to that Zax? Right? And I've done this countless times, and other people have contacted me saying, hey, why did you search for this guy? Why did you search for this guy? And you never know who you could find, family members or people interested in the family. So keep an eye on that. That's an interesting tool to use. And finally, you can't do this work to find out details of the Holocaust without curiosity about your own family genealogy. And an important thing I want to mention to you is all of these towns throughout Europe, these small little towns, they all have town halls with archives. And many of them, almost none of them are online, right? Many of them you can't get into because they're in vaults, they're sealed, you need permission, you need training, you have to wear white gloves, to handle these documents that are potentially 100 years old, right? So there's a ton more information about your family to be found, but maybe you can't find it either at home or even if you go there. So I want to mention to you that there are companies, right, that you can hire to do your searches for you. I found one in Warsaw, Poland. I actually hired him to give me a tour of Będzin, Poland. He worked for months to find information. It did cost me about $350, which I thought was incredibly cheap for what he did. But he sent me tons of images, right? Here's him taking a picture of the grammar school enrollment of not my father, but of his older brother, Shia, right? So here's Shia Zax. Here's my grandparents' names. But again, interestingly enough, it shows a different address. So this is an address that I also visited when I was in Będzin, Poland. This is where my parents, my father used to live before they moved to that house that I now know. But you find school records. He found records of my father owning the horse. He had to have a horse record. Remember, I showed you the Będzin 1939 census. He actually sent me the actual census from the book itself, birth records of my father, and he actually went to the trouble of drawing out my entire family tree back to the 1700s, right? He tracked down all of my family genealogy to the point that when I visited Będzin, I actually was able to go to the nearby cemetery and I was able to say Kaddish for my great-great-grandfather, right? I found his grave and another great-grandfather, and I said Kaddish at his grave. So I actually found, my relatives and their cemetery plot. But again, you have to hire a genealogy company to do this. That's about all the training I can give you. I just want to give you some finishing thoughts of things to keep in mind. All of this research is not a weekend project. You have to have patience. You have to think of it as a long-term, part-time hobby, right? And, after 6 years, I still go back to Arrowson Archives because you never know what else is going to be added or new things that are found. I also have to ask you to please just start. Do it. These stories need to be told, and they need to be told in any detail and any level and in any format, okay? I've got audio cassettes of my parents. I've got a book of all of the translation and all of the research I've done. That's donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. You can find all my research there. I want you to start anywhere with any small amount of information and try and track this information down. It's important for our legacy. Um, do it by talking to members of your family, talk to friends of your family, talk to their children who are also doing this work. Try and find common ground, try and find common experiences, and even through that family finder, talk to strangers who were also on the same death march, right? And see if they knew your parents, see if they knew what the experience was like. Try to visit these places because, first of all, many of these camps have their own museums and their own archives, but standing in Dachau, standing in Auschwitz-Birkenau, it's an amazing experience that it's overwhelming, and you cannot get an impression of what it must have been like by seeing it on pictures on the television or on the books. And when you put together your information, think about how you want to do it. Try not to document a history lesson. People in the future learn history in school. Make it relatable by making it personal, right? And decide if you're doing a family biography of your whole family or a detailed story about one particular person. That's the insight I can give you. I hope it helps. I'm going to open this up to questions in just a minute. But I do want to mention my website, geraldzacks.com. It's a way to contact me. It's the easiest way to contact me. You can rewatch this talk, or you can see my other talk, my parents' experience, right, of surviving the Holocaust. You can get to my website, geraldzacks.com, by typing that in, or this QR code will take you there. I also want to ask, the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West has been absolutely incredible in trying to give me venues to give my talks, but I am always interested in any other opportunity. So please offer my presentations, either my parents' experience or this training research, to any school, synagogue, churches, or public libraries. I'm always open. I never charge any fees. So I'll open it up to questions now, and while we do questions, I want to leave this screen up. Again, it has the QR code to find me, but it lists some of the more important and useful online databases and contact information that I used in order to put this together. The top ones are free. These ones actually are genealogy searches. Some of them actually either cost money or you need to give a donation. And finally, the green is how to interpret your information. And while this is on the screen, you can take a picture of it with your phone, and I would take any questions that you have. Thank you very much.